Okay, so you want to own a chocolate factory. Rows of tempering machines, the smell of roasting cacao drifting through the building, glossy bars rolling off a conveyor belt into shiny wrappers people actually get excited to open. It sounds like one of the most delightful businesses a person could possibly run, equal parts art and industry, the kind of thing that shows up in kids' storybooks as the dream job. And here's the twist nobody puts in the storybook. Chocolate is one of the most brutal commodity businesses on the planet right now, sitting on top of a raw material that has swung more violently in price over the last 3 years than almost anything else people put in their mouths. Some chocolate makers are watching their margins get shredded in real time. A small number of operators, meanwhile, have built businesses that are quietly some of the most profitable in the entire food industry. By the end of this, you'll know what it actually costs to build a chocolate operation, how the money really moves from cacao pod to candy aisle, what the hidden costs are that catch almost every new maker off guard, and what a realistic month of profit looks like once the romance gets replaced by the spreadsheet. Let's start with what it actually costs to get into this, because just like the last few industries we've broken down, chocolate factory isn't one business, it's several, sitting inside the same word. At the smallest end is the bean-to-bar craft maker, someone buying roasted or raw cacao beans directly and running the entire process themselves, roasting, cracking, grinding, conching, and tempering in a small commercial kitchen. A serious starter setup, a melanger for grinding, a tempering machine, a roaster, and basic packaging equipment typically runs somewhere between $15,000 and $40,000 for genuinely small batch production. One level up is a compound or couverture operation, a maker who buys pre-processed chocolate in bulk, blocks from a supplier, and focuses on molding, flavoring, and branding rather than starting from raw beans. That route trims the equipment list dramatically, since you're skipping the roasting and grinding stages entirely, and a workable setup can run somewhere in the range of $10,000 to $25,000. Then there's the mid-size commercial confectioner, the kind of operation supplying grocery store shelves or wholesale accounts, which requires industrial tempering lines, enrobing machines that coat centers in chocolate at scale, cooling tunnels, and packaging automation. That tier of equipment alone commonly runs $300,000 to over $2 million depending on throughput, before you've even leased a facility large enough to hold it. And at the very top sits full industrial production, the kind of plant that runs continuously and ships pallets rather than boxes, where a single production line can cost anywhere from $5 to $20 million once you include climate-controlled storage for raw cacao, industrial-grade food safety systems, and the certifications required to sell into national retail chains. So the spectrum runs from a determined home cook with a $15,000 setup selling at farmers markets, all the way to a facility that costs more than most people's houses multiplied 100 times, and the raw ingredient sitting at the center of every single one of those tiers has become dramatically more expensive to buy than it was just a few years ago. So how does the money actually flow once the chocolate exists? Here's the part that makes this industry unlike almost anything else in food. Cocoa is a commodity, traded on futures markets the same way oil and wheat are, and it went through one of the wildest price runs in the history of any agricultural commodity. Back in the early 2020s, cocoa traded in a fairly stable band, roughly $2,300 to $2,800 a metric ton. Then years of poor weather and disease in West Africa, which supplies the majority of the world's cocoa, collapsed the harvest, and by the end of 2024, prices had spiked past $12,000 a ton, roughly a 5-fold increase in under 2 years. Prices have since pulled back into a range closer to $5,000 to $6,000 a ton, which sounds like relief, except that's still more than double where the entire industry built its pricing models. That single fact changes the whole business. A chocolate maker who could once buy a ton of cacao for around $2 a pound is now paying $2.50 to $3 a pound even after the recent pullback. And every bar, every truffle, every wholesale contract has to be repriced around that new floor. Industrial giants have some cushion here because they hedge years of supply in advance through futures contracts and can absorb short-term spikes, and they can also reformulate, quietly reducing the percentage of actual cocoa in a bar and leaning more on sugar, milk solids, and fillers to protect margin. Craft and small batch makers don't have that luxury. They're buying smaller volumes, often through direct trade relationships with farmers that lock in fair, transparent pricing rather than chasing the futures market, which means quality and traceability come at a real premium, but it also means they feel every price swing with almost no ability to smooth it out. On the revenue side, a basic bar retailing for $4 to $6 might carry raw cacao costs of 50 cents to $1, depending on the percentage of cacao used, packaging and labor eating another chunk, leaving gross margins that typically run 50 to 65% before you touch overhead. Wholesale accounts change that math immediately, since retailers commonly demand a 50% margin on top of your wholesale price, which means the price a customer pays in a store can be roughly double what you actually charge the retailer, and your effective margin as the maker shrinks accordingly. Now for the stuff nobody warns you about before they get into this. First, spoilage and shelf life. Chocolate is temperature sensitive in a way most food products aren't, and improperly stored inventory can bloom, that chalky white discoloration that happens when cocoa butter separates, which doesn't make it unsafe, but makes it unsellable to a customer expecting a glossy bar. Facilities need climate control year-round, and that's a real utility cost that never goes away, especially shipping through summer months, when a box left on a porch can turn a finished product into a melted loss. Second, the labor intensity that most people underestimate. Tempering chocolate correctly, cooling it through a precise temperature curve so it sets with the right snap and shine, is genuinely difficult to automate at small scale, and a lot of early-stage makers are doing this by hand, batch after batch, which caps how much product a single person can physically produce in a day regardless of demand. Third, packaging costs have quietly become one of the largest line items in the entire business. Food-safe wrapping, printed boxes, tamper-evident seals, and the recent wave of tariff-driven cost increases on imported packaging materials have pushed this expense up substantially, and several established chocolate makers have publicly said that packaging costs rising at the same time as cocoa costs has been the genuinely brutal combination, since absorbing either alone might have been survivable. Fourth, certifications and compliance. Selling into grocery chains typically requires food safety certifications that can cost tens of thousands of dollars to obtain and maintain, plus regular audits. And increasingly, buyers overseas are requiring deforestation and traceability documentation on where the cocoa actually came from, adding a compliance layer that didn't exist a decade ago. Fifth, seasonality. A huge share of chocolate sales cluster around Valentine's Day, Easter, and the winter holidays, which means a maker can spend months building inventory for a handful of concentrated selling windows, and a single bad shipping delay or a slow retail season can wreck a year's worth of planning. So who's actually winning at this? At the very top, companies like Lindt, Hershey, and Nestlé have scale on their side. They hedge cocoa purchases years in advance. They can reformulate recipes to manage cost, and they can raise consumer prices broadly across a category where shoppers have limited substitutes, which is exactly what happened when Lindt raised prices by nearly a fifth in a single year, and still moved product because chocolate purchases are often emotional rather than price-sensitive. In the middle tier sit regional confectioners supplying wholesale accounts and their own retail stores, businesses that have survived by controlling their own supply chain tightly and diversifying into gift baskets, corporate orders, and subscription boxes that carry higher margins than a basic bar. And at the craft end, bean-to-bar makers who lean hard into direct trade relationships and traceability have actually found an advantage in the current environment, because customers willing to pay $8 to $12 for a bar are paying for a story and a quality difference, not just cocoa content, which insulates that segment somewhat from the commodity price wars playing out at the mass market level. The pattern across all three tiers is the same one we keep seeing in every business like this. The operators who survive aren't the ones who got lucky on cocoa prices. They're the ones who built a pricing and sourcing model that could absorb a shock like the one this industry just went through. How do people actually lose money on this? Almost nobody goes broke because their chocolate tasted bad. They go broke because they priced their product around yesterday's cocoa cost and didn't leave room for tomorrow's. A maker who locks in retail pricing, prints packaging with that price on it, and signs wholesale contracts months in advance can find themselves selling every single bar at a loss the moment cocoa prices move against them, because unlike a coffee shop that can just raise the price of a latte next week, a packaged consumer product with printed pricing and existing retail agreements is much slower to adjust. The second failure pattern is overinvesting in equipment before the sales volume exists to justify it. Buying an industrial tempering line sized for a business that's still selling at farmers markets, which turns fixed costs into a monthly weight that crushes a small operation regardless of how good the chocolate actually is. Okay, so what can you actually walk away with? Take a realistic small bean-to-bar operation producing around 1,500 bars a month, sold at a blended average of $6 each through a mix of retail and wholesale. That's roughly $9,000 in monthly revenue. After raw cacao, sugar, packaging, and labor, which on a small operation commonly eats 60 to 65% of revenue given current cocoa costs, you're left with somewhere around $3,200 in monthly gross profit. And after rent, utilities, and basic overhead, a realistic take-home lands closer to $1,500 to $2,000 a month, a real but modest number for the amount of hands-on labor involved. Now the stronger version. A maker who's built wholesale relationships with a dozen specialty grocers and a growing direct-to-consumer subscription program, moving closer to 8,000 bars a month at that same blended pricing, sees revenue climb toward $48,000 monthly, and with better economies of scale on packaging and slightly improved margins from direct trade relationships that lock in cocoa pricing ahead of market swings, monthly profit can realistically land in the $12,000 to $16,000 range, which is the kind of number that actually starts to look like a real business rather than a labor of love. So yeah, you can start a chocolate business with a melanger and a dream on a kitchen counter this weekend. Most people who try it will get squeezed between a cocoa market that's more volatile than it's been in generations, and customers who have limits on what they'll pay for a candy bar, no matter how good the story behind it is. The ones who make it work aren't the ones with the best tasting chocolate in the batch tasting room. They're the ones who understood, from the very first bar, that they weren't just in the chocolate business, they were in the commodity risk business too, and priced accordingly.